Important notes about online learning. On the course page, you'll find a very useful document with some hints and tips on how to manage your data and to reduce your data consumption. Download the slides and go through them along with the video or audio, and please pay special attention to the lecture outcomes. The outcomes tell you what you need to be able to do in order to pass the assessment. This means that the outcomes define the scope of your assessment. You still need to make notes and try and express things in your own words, and this is going to be very important for your own understanding. You still need to go through the prescribed reading and do the exercises, and you still need to explore further through additional reading, online investigation. For instance, YouTube has some wonderful linguistic resources. Remember that your evidence of engagement will all be part of your portfolio. Every lecturer hopes that all students do these things anyway, but when you are doing online learning from home, the opportunities to do so are quite different. It becomes even more important that you do these things. You will need to manage your own time and take responsibility for your own learning. Hold tight and enjoy the lecture. Minimality, C command and movement. We started the course looking for evidence for hierarchical structure in language, and the first thing we looked at was constituency, the idea that sentences are made up of chunks of things which later we can identify as phrases. Phrases are linked to each other through a number of relationships, one of which is C command, and we looked for evidence of C command in polarity items, in agreement phenomena, in binding and reference, and finally today we're going to be looking at the idea of movement, which also involves minimality, which itself depends on C command. So let's start off with some linguistic puzzles. Why can you say who ate what, but not what did who eat? Both are question sentences, both have two question words, and we know that in English the question word can go to the front. So it's clear that either or both question words should be able to move to the front, but what we see in fact is that there is a limitation insofar as only one of them can actually move. Similarly, why can you say who came when, but not when did who come? The same kind of logic applies. Here's another puzzle. If you have the sentence, Zuki gave a present to Stella, you are able to passivize it and promote the direct object to the front of the sentence. So you would have a bracelet was given to Stella by Zuki, or alternatively, a letter was written to Stella by Zuki. Both show the direct object being promoted to the grammatical subject in the passivization construction. However, you can't do that in the following sentence. Zuki gave Stella a present, and in this sentence, you cannot front bracelet, so the direct object bracelet cannot become the grammatical subject. A bracelet was given Stella by Zuki is ungrammatical, as is a letter was written Stella by Zuki. So these are the kinds of questions we're going to be dealing with today. But before we do so, let's cover a few basics that we would have done in Linguistics 1 and just remind ourselves what they are. So when it comes to the idea of subjects and subjecthood, we need to distinguish between semantic subjects and grammatical subjects. Semantic subjects are often, but not always, agents, doers, and causes of an event. So the idea of a semantic subject is that in the meaning, remember semantics means meaning, in the meaning, these noun phrases often initiate or cause events to happen. When a semantic subject is passivized, they often occur in a by phrase. For instance, lemon curd was eaten by her. Who is doing the eating? Well, it must be her. And so we see that semantic subject in the by phrase, even though in this example it is not the grammatical subject. And that's the next thing I want to talk about. Grammatical subjects trigger agreement on verbs. And we saw that a few weeks ago. For instance, she eats lemon curd. The eats is the third person singular present marker, which is agreeing with she in this instance. She is the grammatical subject. By the same token, they eat lemon curd doesn't have an overt agreement marker because that agreement marker is a null marker. So a null marker is the third person singular present marker, which agrees with they. You might also remember that from Linguistics 1, that the subject of a sentence is also the sister of the verb phrase. Let's also remind ourselves about movement. So sentences are not static, and language is not just a list of sentences, but in fact sentences are derived from each other in such a way that it seems that stuff often moves around. For instance, you can have a sentence like, I like Zuki, but you can also rephrase that as, it is Zuki that I like, where Zuki has moved from the object position of like and has been fronted in a cleft structure. Similarly, you could take the sentence I like Zuki and passivize it to form Zuki was liked, where the direct semantic object becomes the grammatical subject. Question constructions also show a range of movement. For instance, you could say, I read a story by Lindiwe Mabuza, and we can turn that into a question and say something like, which story by Lindiwe Mabuza did you read? And what we notice there is that the noun phrase is fronted. It goes to the front of the sentence, leaving a gap behind. Another construction that we're going to be looking at today is raising. A raising construction looks like the following. It seems a story by Lindiwe Mabuza is very popular. And in a raising construction, we have a verb like with seems. There are a number of other verbs that do this, but seem is a nice example. And this selects a sentence as its complement. And that sentence can either be finite or non-finite. So this sentence can also be rewritten as a story by Lindiwe Mabuza seems to be very popular. And there you can see that a story by Lindiwe Mabuza, that noun phrase, has moved to the front of the sentence to become the subject of the verb seems. And it triggers an agreement on the verb seems as well. And it leaves a gap behind. So these are some of the constructions we're going to be looking at today. Passivization, question formation, and raising constructions. While we're talking about movement, let's spend a little bit of time talking about gaps. So when XP, a noun phrase, a verb phrase, or any phrase moves in a sentence, it leaves a gap where it used to be. We can say that there is a gap. Alternatively, we can also say that the XP leaves a trace or that it leaves behind an unpronounced copy of itself. These are all ways that we use to refer to these gaps in the tree. Gap is the most theory neutral, whereas trace and unpronounced copy are quite specific to generative grammar and Chomsky minimalist syntax in particular. So here are some examples just to get you started. You might do the following. It is Zuki that I like, and here I've just used an underscore to show a gap. You could say it is Zuki that I like, and here I've used a trace, a little t, to indicate that this is where the moved constituent comes from. And finally, you can also use a strike out to imply that this is an unpronounced copy of itself. All are perfectly legitimate ways of expressing this idea that moved categories leave an empty spot behind them. You'll also notice that there are little red indexes, J or a little smiley face or a little alpha. Now, all that is meant to show is that the gap and the constituent that is moved are linked together. And we use a little index of some sort just to show that they are the same. So that means that Zuki, which is marked with J, originates in the gap marked with J. Any symbol will do. So don't be too worried about whether it's an I or J, or K and L, or a Q, or a smiley face, or a star, or a pointy finger. None of that really matters. All you're looking at is, does the index show that the moved constituents originates at a certain point? Have a look at some basic constructions. We're going to start with passives. In the slides that follow, we're going to be doing passive without the aid of syntactic trees. However, I would very much like you to try and draw trees or try and work out what the trees might look like as you go through your tutorials or in your own private study. So what is passivization? Passivization occurs when a semantic object can become the grammatical subject of a sentence. And this contrasts with an active sentence where the semantic subject is generally also the grammatical subject. So let's have a look. Zuki ate the cake is what we might call an active sentence. There's a verbal event of eating, and Zuki is doing the eating. Zuki is the doer. Zuki is also the grammatical subject and is triggering agreement on ate, while the cake is the patient, the thing that is undergoing the eating event. In a passive sentence, what you do is you take the subject, in this case Zuki, and you either delete it completely or you put it in a bi-phrase, and then the semantic object is put into the subject position. And this gives us the cake was eaten. So you can see that the cake, which is the object, has moved to the front of the sentence where it is now the grammatical subject. Here's another example. Zuki gave Stella a bracelet, or if you passivize that, you remove Zuki and either put it into a bi-phrase or delete completely, and then you can move Stella to the subject position and you get Stella was given a bracelet. Once we've got that sentence, you can actually passivize it again. You take the subject, which was now becomes Stella, and you delete that or put it in a to phrase with a preposition. And then you would take the bracelet, which is now the object, and promote it to the subject position, and you get a bracelet was given to Stella by Zuki. So in this example, we've actually had two instances of passivization, and in each case, what we see is that the object moves to the front of the sentence. However, although we can move any of the arguments to the front of the sentence as part of the passivization process, we can't move any one of them at any point. There are constraints on what we can move and when. Let's start off with Zuki gave Stella a bracelet and passivize it and say Stella was given a bracelet by Zuki. So far, so good, right? Now, what would happen is instead of passivizing it by moving Stella, we try to passivize it by moving the noun phrase a bracelet. This would give us a bracelet was given Stella by Zuki, which is an ungrammatical sentence. So here is a nice contrast. We can see one noun phrase can move to the front while the other one cannot. And the question is then going to become, what is causing this type of constraint? What is preventing both of them being able to move equally? Put another way, we could say that there is an asymmetry between these two objects with respect to the amount that they're able to move. So the generalization we might come up with here is something like a noun phrase can't move across another noun phrase as part of the passivization process. And you can see how that happened in the last example where a bracelet had to move across Stella in order to get to the front. So it seems that moving across another noun phrase is what's causing the problem there. Let's look at raising and see if we can see any similar patterns arising. Raising verbs are usually things like seem to or is likely to. These are the most common ones. So raising constructions occur when a raising verb selects an infinitival complement and a noun phrase from the embedded clause can raise to become the subject of the matrix clause. Let's see how that works. It seemed Zuki gave Stella a present. Well, we see there are two verbs there, give, and Zuki is the doer of the giving, and Stella and the bracelet are the various objects. So that's our embedded clause. And then there's a matrix clause, it seemed, where the main verb there is seem with it being a dummy subject. Now, where this becomes interesting is if you remove that dummy subject, you can move those noun phrases to the front of the sentence. So you can have something like Zuki seemed to give Stella a bracelet. In this instance, we'll see that Zuki has moved to the front and that the embedded clause is an infinitival. So this is the classic pattern that we might see in this phenomenon called raising. Now, we can also, just like with passives, do the raising process again. So if we delete Zuki from the subject position, we can then take Stella and move that to the front of the sentence, and then you would say Stella seemed to be given a bracelet. And this, of course, is a passive because it is the passive process that would delete the semantic subject. And we can passivize it again or apply the raising process again. A bracelet seemed to be given. That's a perfectly grammatical sentence. In this case, we've taken a bracelet and moved it to the front of the matrix verb. So this has actually moved quite a long way from the complement of the embedded verb to the grammatical subject position of the matrix raising verb seem. And what does this show? It shows us that any of these noun phrases can move to the front of the sentence as part of the raising process. However, just like there were constraints on passivization and what can move, there are also constraints on what can move in the raising context. If we start with our sentence, it seemed Zuki gave Stella a bracelet, and then let's imagine that we move Stella to the front of the sentence, just like we did on the previous slide, but in this case, we do not remove Zuki from the equation. In that case, we get a sentence like, Stella seemed Zuki gave a present, which is ungrammatical. How about if we move the bracelet to the front of that sentence? And then you would get, a bracelet seemed Zuki gave Stella. Again, ungrammatical. And just in case you're thinking it's because these ones are not passivized, whereas the previous slides did have passive examples, have a look at this. We move a bracelet to the front of the sentence in a passive construction. So we end up with a bracelet seemed to be given Stella. Again, ungrammatical. But interestingly, one kind of passive that you can say is a bracelet seems to be given to Stella. And in that case, Stella has been put into a prepositional phrase. I'm going to leave it for you to think about why you can say the one and not the other. Again, if we look at the patterns that seem to be happening in these examples, in all the ungrammatical ones, we have a noun phrase which is moved to the front of the sentence across another noun phrase. So it would seem that a noun phrase can't move across another noun phrase as part of raising movement either. Incidentally, if you are wondering where C command comes into this, if you were to draw trees of these constructions, and I would advise you to do that, you will be able to plot the C command relationships between Zuki, Stella, and a bracelet. What you'll notice is that the subject position at the front of the sentence, the subject of seem, C commands Zuki, Stella, and a bracelet. In other words, it C commands all those potential positions. And just going off scripture, we could also speculate then that that is the same kind of configuration that agree seems to apply in, where the top end of the agree chain has to C command the bottom end of the agree chain. We could also speculate, again, completely off script, that the relationship between the move position and which noun phrase can move to that position has some similarities with binding. You'll remember that the relationship between an anaphor and its antecedent is given by a C command relationship within a particular kind of domain. So there are some similarities there that we might want to explore off camera. Let's move on to WH questions. In WH questions, the question phrase moves to the front of the sentence. Question phrases include who, when, why, what, where, and also how, which although it technically is not spelled with a WH, is considered a WH phrase. Here's an example of a question with the WH as the subject, who ate the cake, and here is one where the WH item is the object which moves to the front of the sentence. Which cakes did Zuki eat? In both cases, we'll notice that the question word occurs in the fronted position, and this seems to indicate that there's a movement relationship between the fronted position and the gap from which they originate. Here's another example. What did Zuki eat? Well, in this case, we have the question phrase what, and it is in the front of the sentence, but it originates as the complement or the object of the verb eat. And we know that because if we were to answer it and say something like big corn bites, so Zuki ate big corn bites, we would see that the answer to the question, big corn bites, occurs as the object of eat. It's a thing that was eaten. However, there also exist multiple WH questions where there's more than one question phrase. And in most of these cases, the WH phrases remain in their original positions in English, but interestingly enough, not in Bulgarian. And maybe that's something you also might want to just look up for your own edification. Here's an example, who ate what? And another example, who gave who which book? In this instance, the subject, the direct object, and the indirect object are all question phrases. So we can demonstrate that any question word can move to the front of the sentence. But it seems that when we have more than one question word which could potentially move, there are some limitations on which ones can move, and by now you can probably guess what those limitations might be. So let's start off with our sentence, which we are very familiar with now. Zuki gave Stella a bracelet, and turn it into a multiple question sentence, which gives us who gave who what. Imagine that you are Sherlock Holmes investigating some kind of a crime scene at a dinner party where someone was passed a poisoned prawn and they ate it and died. And then afterwards, we have to ask ourselves, well, in order to track down who was the murderer, who gave who what, right? That's what we want to know. And then the answer might be, well, Mark gave Susan a prawn, Billy Bob gave Nandi a cracker, and Shanaz gave Kane a glass of white wine. However, there are some limitations on what we can move where. Did you see what I did there? Here's an example of something that's ungrammatical. What did who give who? And in this case, we've taken the object what and moved it to the front across two other question words. And this seems to be ungrammatical. How about who did who give what? Another ungrammatical example. And again, the generalization seems to be that you can't move a WH item across another WH item. Does that sound familiar? Well, it should, because these are the same kinds of patterns we've seen in the previous two examples of passivization and raising. The difference here is, whereas those apply to noun phrases, this applies to a particular type of noun phrase, in this case, a question word. So if we pull this all together, we get three generalizations, which are nominally separate. Generalization 1, a noun phrase can't move across another noun phrase as part of passivization. Generalization 2, a noun phrase can't move across another noun phrase as a part of raising. Generalization 3, you can't move a question item across another question item as part of the question formation process. These are 3 separate grammatical rules, and we could just live with it. We could just say, look, when you learn language, there are 3 separate rules you have to learn, and these are them. And, in one sense, we could live with that, but it's not very elegant. And it seems to miss the fact that there clearly is a bigger generalization to be made. There is some similarity between these that may make us want to theorize these a little bit more. And that is exactly what Luigi Rizzi did in his 1990 paper when he postulated the idea of relativized minimality, which can more or less be stated as during movement, an XP, or a phrase of some kind, cannot move across another phrase of the same type. Now, what do we mean by phrases of the same type? Phrases are of the same type if they are not distinguished by at least one feature, such as a question feature, or a focus feature, or some other kind of feature. And incidentally, if we were to just examine that definition a little bit more, it also refers to move. It says a phrase cannot move across another phrase of the same type, and we must remember that movement has some restrictions on it, including a C command restriction. Remember our discussion of the empty category principle a couple of minutes ago? Well, don't forget that a moved item must move to a position that C commands the trace or the base of the tail. Let's spare a moment to think a little bit about this idea of movement. We have seen some examples that seem to show that language does have movement, and that you can take a basic sentence and switch it around a little bit to get different kinds of meanings. And so it's fair to postulate this idea of a basic operation called move, which moves things around. However, if we moved anything around at any point, we'd quickly end up with a kind of word salad. For instance, Matt the sack cat on. That's clearly not an English sentence. It doesn't even have any English kind of structure. And if we can move things around in a completely unconstrained way, we're quickly going to end up with utter chaos. So it's very clear that even if we do have something that allows movement, this movement must be constrained or limited in some ways. Now, we're going to be talking a little bit about some of these limitations. The first one is that movement always moves to a position that C commands the trace or the gap. This is also known as the empty category principle, often just called the ECP. Let me say that again. Movement always moves something to a position that C commands the trace. And I'm not going to show a lot of examples of that, but it merely means that when you move, you must move upwards, and you must move to a position in the tree which you can C command out of. Now, as language scientists, we are trying to develop a very basic toolbox of what we need to be able to derive the sentences of a language, not just one language like English, but any language. And so while on the one hand we do need to postulate new tools, at the same time we also need to think about, do we really need the tools, or is there already something in the toolbox that does the same job? So think for a minute about this notion of the ECP, and doesn't it look a little bit similar to the idea that agree always probes a feature that it C commands? So here we have two things, or two operations, both of which seem to have a C command relationship between the beginning and the end of the chain. By the chain, I mean a long distance relationship inside the tree. So what if we were to actually combine these two things so that we don't need the ECP per se as a separate thing, but that we bundle it into agreement? Let's imagine that there is something called a movement feature and probes a suitable phrase to move, and that it uses agree to do so. You remember agree uses probes the C command domain, checks features, etc. By the way, such a movement feature does exist, and it's called the EPP, or an EPP feature if you prefer. And this stands for the Extended Projection Principle, which began as a long debate. The EPP lets the grammar know that this particular feature needs something to move to its position. But this also raises a lot of questions, which we're not going to be able to address in this course, and you'll have to do syntax 3 in order to find this out. For instance, do all languages have the same kinds of movement? Is movement always quote-unquote visible, or can movements mask other movements so that we don't realize that they're happening? So is there a way, if you like, to have covert movement or camouflaged movement? Another question is moving a big constituent more difficult than a small one? Are there positions to which movement cannot occur? Are there phrases from which movement cannot occur? And these are all very interesting questions. There's no way I can do that in one lecture. So we will have to postpone that for your future studies in syntax. Earlier on in the lecture, we speculated that in order to limit movement and prevent it just from applying willy-nilly and causing word salad left and right, that it would probably be a good idea to have movement being triggered or made to happen in some way using a feature. And that opened the door, we speculated, to linking movement and agree. So let us draw some of those abstract ideas together into a discussion of the probe and move cycle and how these might interact. So let's take our sentence, it seems Stella wants a bracelet, and we might want to think about how we might want to derive that. So in order to get to the sentence that is on the screen, we would then take the noun phrase it and merge it into the subject position, which is the sister of VP1. And then agree would apply, and we'd get something like, it seems Stella wants a bracelet. However, let's imagine that we are not going to merge the dummy subject, the it, and that we're going to want to end up with Stella being promoted to the subject. So the sentence we want to end up with is something like, Stella seems to want a bracelet. Now, in order to work out what's going to happen, we do need to actually look at our features and how agree is going to work in this particular configuration. The infil node of a finite sentence, which contributes tense to the sentence, has uninterpretable phi features and also interpretable case features. Indicated that seem has uninterpretable phi features, Stella has interpretable phi features, and a bracelet has interpretable phi features. Incidentally, they also have case features, which I will talk about in a separate slide. For the moment, let's just look at the agreement relationships relating to phi features. So what's going to happen? Well, seem, which is uninterpretable phi features, those need to be checked. It's going to probe its C command domain, and that's going to bring it to Stella, which has those interpretable phi features. It can also probe all the way down to a bracelet, because seem also C commands a bracelet. However, as we have seen in previous examples, a bracelet is not the thing that's going to end up triggering agreement on seem, and we understand why now. It is because agree cannot look across another noun phrase of the same type. So we're actually seeing relativized minimality come into play in agree as well. What happens next? Well, once agree has established a relationship between the interpretable features on Stella and the uninterpretable ones on seems, the uninterpretable features are deleted and any information is transferred accordingly, which result in our agreement seems, which is third person singular, agreeing with Stella. And then in order to get our word order right, we would have to say that Stella now moves to the subject position of seems, yielding Stella seems to want a bracelet. And this will be the movement process. But let's scratch a little bit deeper. Why would the noun phrase Stella want to move? Or why would any noun phrase want to move? And there are multiple reasons, and a lot of them are quite language specific. And this is the kind of thing that gets linguists and syntacticians in particular quite excited. So here is one possibility, and I promised to talk about case, and here it is. As I've said in previous lectures, the infil node of a finite sentence, which contributes tense to the sentence, has uninterpretable phi features and also interpretable case features. And let us suppose that case has an EPP feature, which I mentioned earlier, is a feature that says I can take part in movement operations. And this will be language specific and it will be part of the lexicon, which is to say that these features are kept in the language specific lexicon that you would use to keep your words and your features and idiomatic phrases, etc. Noun phrases all have uninterpretable case, which is another way of saying they need to be assigned a case of some kind. So Stella has uninterpretable case, and interestingly enough, the object, a bracelet, must also have uninterpretable case. And what happens there, of course, is that at a previous step before this one, the verb want assigns accusative case to the bracelet. And then deletion of that uninterpretable case feature happens. So I don't want to focus on that right now. I rather want to focus on a subsequent phase of the derivation involving checking of case on the matrix verb seems. So Stella, which has uninterpretable case, that case needs to be checked. It's going to probe its C command domain, trying to find an interpretable case feature somewhere. It's not going to find one because any previous case features have been eliminated as part of the derivation. However, there is a feature higher up, an interpretable case feature on seams, which is associated with a movement feature. So let's imagine that Stella then moves to become the subject of the matrix verb seems. This means that it is now in a position where its uninterpretable feature C commands the interpretable case feature. So what is happening here? Let me try and put it in a much simpler form. When you have an uninterpretable feature, it looks in its C command domain, it looks down the tree to try and find something to check its features. If it finds that feature, well and good. If it doesn't, it is kind of stuck. However, it is also possible for a constituent to move upwards in the tree to a new position from which it can undertake agreement again. Look down the tree, probe its C command domain, and see if in its moved position it is able to check off its features. If we are persuaded by this kind of idea, then it does tick off a number of important theoretical points. We have managed to explain why movement doesn't happen all the time and to any willy-nilly position. It only moves when there is a feature that needs to be checked. And it can't move to any position because it needs to move to a position where agree can happen. In other words, it is constrained by C command. It also means that while we postulate the operation move, a lot of the mechanics of move, namely what moves to where and the kinds of relationships that move engages in, is actually determined by agree. And so ultimately, our syntax or our syntactic operations really look quite simple. We have a lexicon with all the words and features and bits and pieces of a language that would be related to a specific language. And then we use merge to build basic trees and put them together depending on the selection characteristics of the lexical items that we're putting together. And when we've done merge, we can undertake agree, constrained by C command, to start checking off any uninterpretable features. Once we've gone through that, we can move certain features around. And once we've done this, we can apply agree again to check off any uninterpretable features. And we would proceed with this cycle of merging parts of the tree, moving and agreeing over and over again until we have built up a complete tree with no uninterpretable features left, which we can then send to our interfaces to be interpreted according to its semantics and to be spelled out in some kind of a physical form, such as words or writing or manual signs. And this leads us to an incredibly counterintuitive but quite satisfying conclusion. It's counterintuitive because at the beginning of the course, we probably would not have thought this, but by theorizing it along the way, we've come to the conclusion that all the diversity of human language can probably be captured by just four basic things. On the one hand, we have a lexicon filled with idiosyncratic features and words. And then we have three universal operations that apply throughout: merge, move, and agree. And this is a good example of how an incredibly complex set of phenomena, such as language, can perhaps be reduced to much simpler principles.